The heavy silver ink pen felt less like a writing instrument and more like a scalpel. Beatrice Sterling sat at the massive mahogany desk in the center of the blackwood drawing room, her fingers trembling so violently that the silver barrel of the pen tapped a frantic, hollow rhythm against the wood. The room was suffocatingly quiet. The only sounds were the relentless drumming of the London rain against the tall, leaded glass windows, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, counting down the final seconds of her dignity. She stared at the thick parchment laid out before her. The legal text was dense, written in sharp, unforgiving calligraphy, but the meaning was brutally simple. It was a complete and irrevocable transfer of the Hawthorne shipping dividends, the very last of her late father's fortune, directly into the Blackwood Estate Trust. Once her signature touched the bottom of that page, she would own nothing. She would be nothing. A single drop of black ink gathered at the nib of the pen. Before she could steady her hand, it fell. It did not land on the paper. It struck the starched gray cuff of her high-colored silk dress, spreading instantly into the fabric like a dark, permanent bruise. She gasped softly, a short, shallow intake of breath, and tried to wipe it away with her thumb, only managing to smear the darkness further into the pale gray silk. The dress was already hideous, a stifling, drab garment chosen specifically by her sister, in law to wash out her complexion and emphasize her exhaustion, but the stain made it look tragic. Do stop fussing with it, Beatrice. It is entirely pathetic. The voice cut through the quiet room with the precision of a glass shard. Lady Clara, Julian's younger sister, sat elegantly perched on a velvet armchair near the fireplace. She wore an extravagant pink silk gown that caught the firelight, her blonde ringlets styled to absolute perfection. She held a porcelain teacup suspended in the air, looking at Beatrice over the gold, painted rim with eyes the color of winter ice. "It is only a dress," Clara continued, taking a delicate sip. "Though I suppose to a merchant's daughter, ruining a yard of silk feels like a great tragedy. You have always been remarkably provincial in your attachments." Beatrice did not look up. Her throat was tight, closing in on itself. She pressed her nails into her palm, trying to anchor herself to the physical pain so she would not shatter. "Clara," a male voice said. It was not a reprimand. It was simply an instruction to be quiet. Julian Sterling, the Duke of Blackwood, stood by the far window. He wore an impeccably tailored midnight blue coat that sat perfectly across his broad shoulders. He was an extraordinarily handsome man, carved from the same aristocratic marble as his ancestors, with a sharp jawline and silver, flecked gray eyes that gave absolutely nothing away. He was her husband, and he had not looked at her once in the past 20 minutes. He stood with his back to the room, watching the rain blur the London streets, his right hand slowly, rhythmically twisting the heavy gold signet ring on his finger, the Blackwood crest, the ring he had sworn would protect her when he placed a much smaller, plainer band on her finger 2 years ago. "Julian," Beatrice whispered. Her voice was thin, completely devoid of the warmth she had brought into this house. "Julian, please. This is everything my father built. It is the last of it. If I sign this, I have no security left. You promised me." "I promised to make you a duchess," Julian interrupted. His voice was smooth, cold, and entirely hollow. He finally turned away from the window, looking at her with a profound, devastating indifference. "And you are one. You wear the title. You live in this house. You have received exactly what your father paid for." "I did not want a title," she said, the words trembling as they left her lips. "I wanted a husband." Clara laughed. It was a short musical sound, deeply cruel. Oh, good heavens. Do not tell me the tradesman's daughter actually believed she was a love match. Money buys many things, Beatrice. It buys entry into our drawing rooms. It buys the right to sit at our tables. But apparently it cannot buy bone structure, and it certainly cannot buy affection. Clara set her teacup down with a sharp clink. "Look at yourself. You are pale, you are plain, and you shrink into the corners of every ballroom as if apologizing for your own existence. Did you truly believe Julian would look at you and see anything other than an account ledger?" Beatrice looked at her husband, praying silently for him to stop his sister, to show even a fraction of the kindness he had feigned during their courtship. Julian's face remained a mask of flawless stone. He walked slowly across the Persian rug, stopping just behind the desk, looming over her. He looked down at the paper, then at the heavy silver pen in her trembling hand, and finally at her face. "Sign the paper, Beatrice," he said quietly. "You do not need this?" she pleaded, her hazel eyes filling with tears. She fought desperately to hold back. The estate debts were cleared last year. The dowry was enough. Why must you take the dividends as well? Because maintaining the Blackwood name requires capital. Julian stated, his tone as casual as if discussing the weather. Because my title requires a standard of living that you, with your merchant sensibilities, fail to understand. You were the price to save this title, Beatrice. A bitter medicine I swallowed to keep my family from ruin. You have served your primary purpose. Do not make this tedious by pretending you possess a value beyond your father's banks. The word struck her physically, a blow to the chest that stopped her breath. A bitter medicine. She stared at the man she had spent 2 years trying to love, the man she had altered her voice for, bound her hair for, stifled her laughter for, just to fit into his suffocating world. He did not hate her. Hate required passion. He felt absolutely nothing for her. Once I signed this. Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper, what happens to me? Julian sighed, a small sound of irritation, as if she were a child refusing to go to bed. You have become a social liability in London. Your melancholy depresses the household, and I am wary of having to excuse your lack of grace at society functions. You will leave for Cornwall tomorrow. Beatrice's head snapped up. Cornwall? Cliffside Manor? Clara supplied, helpfully examining her fingernails. It is an old Blackwood estate on the coast, rather isolated. Mostly ruins and sea salt, I'm afraid, but the air is said to be good for the nerves, and more importantly, you will be out of our way. You are banishing me, Beatrice said, the reality freezing the blood in her veins. You are taking my entire fortune, stripping my rights, and sending me to a ruined house on a cliff so you may live as a bachelor in London with my money. I am giving you a quiet life, Julian corrected smoothly, which is far more than your breeding entitles you to. Sign. Beatrice looked down at the silver pen. She looked at the black ink staining her grey cuff. The ink was dark, absolute, and permanent, just like her ruin. She did not cry. The tears that had been threatening to fall suddenly dried, replaced by a cold, numbing clarity. She had been foolish. She had believed that loyalty and love could earn her a place among people who only respected power. Her hand stopped trembling. She gripped the silver pen tightly. She pressed the nib to the parchment, and with a swift, steady motion, she signed her name, Beatrice Sterling. She did not write Duchess of Blackwood. She laid the heavy pen back onto the desk. It landed with a dull, final thud. Julian immediately reached down and pulled the parchment away, checking the signature with a satisfied, dismissive nod. He had what he wanted. She no longer existed to him. Beatrice stood up. Her legs felt weak, but she forced her spine straight. She smoothed the skirt of her hideous grey dress, deliberately covering the ink-stained cuff with her other hand. I will pack my things, she said quietly. Her voice was completely flat. Take only what you need. Clara murmured, already turning her attention back to the fireplace. There is no one in Cornwall to dress for. Julian did not even look up from the document. Beatrice walked toward the heavy oak doors of the drawing room. Every step felt like walking through deep water, but she did not look back. She stepped out into the cold, empty hallway, the heavy doors clicking shut behind her, sealing her out of the world she had bought and leaving her with nothing but a stained sleeve and a one-way ticket to the edge of the ocean. The London rain did not stop. It fell in heavy, grey sheets, washing the color from the streets and turning the city into a blurred, freezing watercolor. Beatrice stood in the grand foyer of Blackwood House. The marble floor, usually gleaming under the light of the crystal chandelier, lay in dim shadows. Beside her feet rested a single leather trunk. 2 years of marriage, 2 years of trying to mold herself into the perfect duchess, and her entire existence had been reduced to a solitary piece of luggage. She looked toward the servants' corridor. It was empty. The halls were perfectly, deliberately silent. No maids peered around the corners. The head butler, who had always offered her a polite nod, was nowhere to be seen. Clara had undoubtedly given the order. The outgoing duchess was not to be afforded the dignity of a farewell. She was to leave like a dismissed parlor maid who had been caught stealing. Beatrice pulled her dark wool cloak tighter around her shoulders. She did not call out. She did not wait. She picked up the heavy trunk herself, the leather strap cutting into her palm, and pushed open the massive front doors. The cold air hit her instantly, smelling of wet pavement and coal smoke. A hired carriage. Not the Blackwood family coach with its velvet seats and gilded crest, but a nameless, unadorned hackney cab waited in the downpour. The driver did not step down to help her. She loaded her own trunk, climbed into the damp, smelling interior, and shut the door. As the carriage lurched forward, Beatrice looked out the window one last time. The grand stone facade of Blackwood House stood tall and impenetrable. From a second-story window, she saw a brief flash of pink silk. Clara watching her leave, making sure the trash was taken out. Beatrice turned her face forward, her jaw setting into a hard line, and let the rain obscure the house forever. The journey took 3 punishing days. The landscape changed from the polite, manicured estates of the home counties to wild, unforgiving terrain. The roads grew rougher, rutted with mud and stones that sent violent shudders through the carriage cabin. Beatrice sat in silence, her body aching, her stomach empty. She barely slept. Whenever she closed her eyes, she felt the heavy weight of the silver pen in her hand. She heard Julian's flat, hollow voice. "You were the price to save this title." She kept her hands folded in her lap. Her right thumb periodically traced the edge of her left cuff. The black ink stain had dried completely. It was stiff and rough against the smooth gray silk, a permanent scar on the fabric. By the late afternoon of the 3rd day, the air shifted. The sharp bite of city smoke was replaced by the raw, biting sting of sea salt. The wind began to howl, shaking the wooden frame of the carriage. "We are here, Your Grace." The driver called out, his voice barely carrying over the sudden, overwhelming roar of nature. Beatrice stepped out of the carriage, her boots sinking into wet gravel. Cliffside Manor did not welcome her. It simply loomed. It was a massive, sprawling structure of dark stone, perched dangerously close to the edge of a jagged cliff. Half of the east wing appeared to have a collapsed roof. Thick black ivy choked the lower windows, and the iron gates were rusted nearly shut. But it was the sound that commanded the space. The ocean crashed against the black rocks far below with a terrifying, rhythmic violence. It was a constant, deafening roar that seemed to vibrate through the soles of her boots and directly into her bones. It was a place of isolation, a place designed to make a person feel incredibly small. An old woman with a severe face and a heavily patched apron opened the heavy front door. She carried a flickering oil lamp that did little to cut through the gloom of the entrance hall. "Gable," the woman said, her voice raspy. She looked at Beatrice, taking in the damp cloak, the solitary trunk, the pale, exhausted face. There was no bow, no curtsy, just the blunt assessment of a caretaker looking at an unwanted guest. "The Duke sent a wire. Said you were coming. Most of the rooms are shut up with dust covers. I prepared the master suite in the west wing. It is the only one that doesn't leak." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Beatrice said. Her voice was quiet, nearly swallowed by the sound of the ocean outside. She carried her own trunk up the sweeping, uncarpeted staircase. The air inside the manor smelled of damp wood, old ashes, and salt. The master suite was vast and freezing. The furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, looking like ghosts waiting in the dark. A small fire sputtered weakly in the grate, failing to warm the room. Beatrice set her trunk down at the foot of the massive four-poster bed. She walked over to the tall windows. They rattled fiercely in their frames. Below her, the ocean churned in black and white foam, violent and endless. She turned away and faced a tall, tarnished standing mirror in the corner of the room. She walked toward it, her footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. She stopped a foot away from the glass and looked at herself. Her hair, usually pinned in a tight, modest chignon, was coming undone, dark chestnut curls escaping to frame a face that looked hollow and bruised. Her skin was ghostly pale. And then there was the dress, the hideous, stifling gray silk dress that Clara had insisted she wear. Beatrice raised her left arm. In the dim light, the black ink stain on the cuff looked like a brand. Of a merchant's daughter, a bit of medicine, a social liability. The words echoed in the cold room, overlapping with the crashing waves outside. This was what they had reduced her to. They had taken her wealth, erased her identity, and discarded her at the edge of the world, expecting her to quietly fade away into the damp stone. They expected her to die here, if not in body, then in spirit. Her breathing hitched. Her chest tightened so painfully she thought her ribs might crack. For one solitary moment, she let the absolute devastation wash over her. Her shoulders shook. Her fingers curled into tight fists, her nails digging so fiercely into her palms that the skin nearly broke. She closed her eyes, and a single burning tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a warm path through the cold. It was the last tear she would ever shed for Julian Sterling. Her eyes snapped open. The sadness in the mirror was gone instantly, replaced by something entirely different, something hard, something cold. She reached for the collar of her dress. Her fingers, no longer trembling, undid the buttons with precise, deliberate movements. She stripped off the heavy wool cloak, letting it fall to the floor. She tore at the gray silk, pushing the stifling fabric down her shoulders, pulling her arms free, until the ink-stained dress pooled at her feet in a lifeless heap. She stood in her white cotton chemise, the freezing air of the drafty room biting at her bare skin. She did not shiver. She walked back to the rattling window and pressed her hand against the cold glass. She listened to the ocean. It was no longer terrifying. It was furious. It was relentless. It tore at the stone, uncaring and unstoppable. Beatrice took a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing, salt-laced air fill her lungs completely. The trembling in her chest stopped. The anxiety that had governed her life for 2 years dissolved into the dark waters below. They had sent her to an exile of ruins. But looking out at the vast, untouchable horizon, Beatrice realized they had made a fatal mistake. They had not buried her. They had set her free. 3 years. 1,095 days. That was how long it took for the ocean to stop sounding like a threat and start sounding like a heartbeat. Cliffside Manor no longer loomed in the dark. It commanded the coast. The crumbling east wing, once open to the harsh winter storms, had been entirely rebuilt with sweeping glass and imported Italian marble. The rusted iron gates were gone, replaced by polished bronze that gleamed under the Cornwall sun. The overgrown courtyards now overflowed with white roses and climbing jasmine, filling the salt, heavy air with an intoxicating, expensive sweetness. The transformation of the estate was nothing short of a miracle to the local villagers, but it was not magic. It was the result of a brilliant, ruthless merchant intellect that Julian Sterling had dismissed as provincial. When Beatrice had been banished, Julian had taken her father's dividends, but he had not been able to take her mind. He had forgotten that a merchant's true wealth was not in the coins inside a vault, but in the knowledge of how to multiply them. In her first year of exile, Beatrice had reached out to her late father's oldest shipping contacts, men who despised the idle aristocracy, and remembered the sharp, calculating girl who used to read maritime charts in her father's study. She had bypassed London entirely. Using the natural deep water cove beneath the cliffs, she established a highly lucrative, discreet trade route for imported wines, fine silks, and European art. Soon, the very people who had ignored her in London's drawing rooms, foreign investors, shipping magnates, and powerful members of Parliament who held the actual purse strings of the empire, were traveling in secret to Cornwall. They did not come to see the Duke of Blackwood. They came to negotiate with the Sovereign of Cliffside. Beatrice stood on the expansive stone balcony of her master's suite, looking out over the endless blue water. The sun was warm against her skin. She closed her eyes, breathing in the sea wind. She was unrecognizable from the shrinking, terrified woman who had arrived in the rain 3 years ago. The stifling corsets and drab, high-collared dresses were entirely gone, having been burned in the courtyard fireplaces during her first winter. Today, she wore a loose, flowing gown of emerald green silk. It draped elegantly over her shoulders, moving like water against her skin, unrestrictive and unapologetically luxurious. Her thick chestnut hair was not pinned back in tight, painful constraints. It fell freely down her back in dark, heavy waves, kissed by the sun and the salt. She opened her eyes, her hazel gaze sharp, clear, and completely devoid of fear. "Your Grace?" A voice called out softly from the doorway. Beatrice turned. Mrs. Gable, the severe caretaker who had once greeted her with a flickering oil lamp and a look of pity, now stood with a posture of absolute, fierce devotion. She managed a staff of 40 impeccably trained servants. "Yes, Gable," Beatrice asked, her voice rich and melodic, carrying easily over the sound of the waves. "Lord Harrington's carriage has just passed the outer gates. He has brought the financial ledgers from the Royal Bank of London, as you requested. The tea service has been laid out in your study." "Thank you," Beatrice said, offering a warm, genuine smile. "Have him shown in immediately. We have a great deal of business to conclude before the afternoon tide." Beatrice walked through the sunlit corridors of her home, the emerald silk trailing silently across polished oak floors. She entered her private study, a massive room lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books and maritime maps. In the center of the room sat a massive desk carved from solid mahogany, and resting perfectly in the center of that desk was a heavy silver ink pen. It was the exact same pen Julian had handed her in the dark drawing room in London. She had taken it with her, not as a painful memory, but as a promise. For 3 years, it had sat on her desk, a silent witness to her resurrection. Lord Harrington, a senior minister in the Treasury, entered the room a moment later. He was an older man, wealthy, and deeply influential, yet he bowed to Beatrice with a level of profound respect he rarely showed to the queen herself. "Duchess," he greeted, taking the seat across from her. He placed a thick leather folio on the desk. "You are looking remarkably radiant. The coastal air continues to serve you well." "Independence serves me well, Lord Harrington." Beatrice replied smoothly, sitting in her high-backed leather chair. "Do you have the documents?" "I do." Harrington unclasped the folio, sliding a stack of heavy parchment across the mahogany surface. "As you predicted, the Duke of Blackwood's financial position has become untenable. His investments in the London railway expansion collapsed completely last month. To maintain his lifestyle and cover Lady Clara's exorbitant gambling debts, he has been quietly mortgaging the remaining Blackwood properties." Beatrice looked down at the papers. Her face remained a mask of flawless, expensive stillness. She felt no spike of adrenaline, no sudden rush of vindictive joy. She only felt the cold, precise satisfaction of an architect watching a poorly built tower begin to lean. "And the promissory notes?" she asked softly. "Purchased in full, through 3 blind proxies, exactly as you instructed." Harrington confirmed, tapping the final document. "Every debt the Duke has incurred over the last 2 years has been consolidated. His creditors are no longer the banks of London, Your Grace. His creditor is you." Beatrice reached out and picked up the silver ink pen. The metal was cool and heavy in her hand. She thought of the black ink staining her grey cuff. She thought of Julian's voice telling her she was merely the price of his title. She uncapped the pen. The ink flowed smoothly, dark and absolute, as she signed the transfer documents. She did not write as Duchess of Blackwood. She signed her name with aggressive, elegant strokes. "Beatrice Hawthorne." She laid the pen down. "Hold the debts," Beatrice commanded, her voice carrying the quiet, terrifying authority of a woman who held a guillotine string and was in no rush to cut it. "Let him feel the pressure. Let the London wolves circle him. When he has absolutely no where else to turn, he will look for a way out. And when he does..." Harrington asked, watching her with a mixture of awe and slight fear. Beatrice leaned back in her chair, the emerald silk catching the sunlight pouring through the large window. She looked out toward the crashing ocean, a small, chilling smile touching the corners of her lips. "When he does," she said softly, "will find me." The London drawing room of Blackwood House had once been a sanctuary of untouchable wealth. Now it felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. The air inside the grand room was stale, smelling of cold ash and lingering desperation. The massive crystal chandelier, which had once cast brilliant, glittering light over aristocratic gatherings, hung dark and silent. Half of its candles were burned down to the nubs, and no servant had been ordered to replace them. There were hardly any servants left to give orders to. Julian Sterling, the Duke of Blackwood, stood by the tall, leaded glass window, looking out at the unrelenting London drizzle. He wore a dark coat, but it was not the impeccably tailored midnight blue garment from 3 years ago. The edges of the cuffs were beginning to fray, a microscopic deterioration that felt like a loud, screaming beacon to anyone in high society. He reached up, his thumb rhythmically twisting the heavy gold signet ring on his finger. The ring spun too easily. It hung loose. The Duke of Blackwood had stopped sleeping, and he had stopped eating with the hearty appetite of a man who owned the world. On the mahogany desk behind him, the exact desk where his wife had once signed away her entire fortune, sat a mountain of thick, cream-colored envelopes. They were not invitations to royal galas or society balls. They were demands, final notices, threats wrapped in polite, bureaucratic ink. "It is an absolute outrage. An unforgivable humiliation!" Lady Clara paced furiously in front of the unlit fireplace. The extravagant pink silk gowns she used to parade in were gone, replaced by a deep burgundy dress that was 2 seasons out of fashion. For a woman whose entire existence was predicated on being the center of high society envy, wearing an outdated dress was a fate worse than death. "Madame Dubois refused to see me today." Clara spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. The modest actually had her shopgirl turn me away at the door. "Me, a daughter of a duke?" She claimed there was an outstanding balance on my account and suggested I shop elsewhere until it was settled. She looked at me as if I were a common beggar on the street. "You are a beggar, Clara," Julian said. His voice was flat, hollowed out by months of creeping ruin. "Well, both are. We are simply begging in drawing rooms instead of alleyways." Clara stopped pacing, staring at her brother with wide, horrified eyes. Do not say such things. You are the Duke of Blackwood. You must simply sell another painting or a horse. Or, there are no more horses. Julian snapped, turning away from the window. The cold aristocratic mask he had worn his entire life was finally cracking, revealing the desperate, terrified man underneath. The stables are empty. The paintings in the West Hall are already scheduled for a quiet auction. Your gambling debts from the summer season drained the last of our liquid capital, and my investments in the Northern Railway collapsed completely last month. He walked over to the mahogany desk and slammed his fist down onto the pile of letters. The Hawthorne dividends are gone. Julian breathed heavily, the reality tasting like ash in his mouth. Beatrice's fortune is gone. I have mortgaged everything that is not strictly entailed to the title. We are drowning Clara, and the London wolves know it. By next month, the bank will seize this house. Clara sank into a velvet armchair, her hands covering her pale face. How did this happen? We had so much. She brought so much. Julian looked down at the desk. There was a small, faded dark spot on the edge of the wood, a faint ghost of a black ink stain. He stared at it, feeling a sudden, strange tightness in his chest. He did not miss his wife. He had never loved her, but he fiercely, agonizingly missed the safety she had provided. He missed the endless cushion of her father's wealth. The heavy oak doors of the drawing room opened, groaning on their hinges. Finch, the family's longtime solicitor, stepped into the room. He did not bow with his usual deep reverence. He merely nodded, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. Your Grace, Finch said, his tone clipped and professional. I have just returned from the Royal Bank. I regret to inform you that the directors have officially refused your request for an extension. They require the sum of £40,000 by the end of the month, or they will begin foreclosure proceedings on the London properties. Julian's vision blurred at the edges. £40,000. He might as well have been asked to produce the moon. There must be something left. Another property. A hunting lodge. Everything of value has been leveraged, Finch replied grimly, except for one. Julian raised his head. What? Cliffside Manor, the estate in Cornwall. Julian let out a harsh, bitter laugh. That pile of rotting stones on a cliff? It was practically falling into the ocean 3 years ago. I sent Beatrice there because it was the only property worthless enough not to sell. You could not get £400 for it, let alone 40,000. Finch pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose. Ordinarily, you would be correct, Your Grace. However, I have been hearing whispers in the financial district. Over the past 3 years, the coastal land surrounding Cliffside has experienced an inexplicable surge in value. An anonymous shipping syndicate has developed a deep water port nearby. The region has become a highly exclusive hub for elite trade. Julian stared at the solicitor, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. I received an inquiry just this morning. Finch continued, opening his briefcase. A foreign investor is willing to pay an exorbitant sum for the deed to Cliffside Manor, enough to clear your debts with the bank entirely with capital to spare. Then sell it. Clara cried out, leaping from her chair. Sell it immediately! Oh, Julian, we are saved! There is a complication, Finch said, slowly, looking directly at the Duke. The deed is not in your name, Your Grace. It is in the name of the Duchess. It was a technicality of the original marriage settlements designed to guarantee her a widow's residence should you pass. You cannot sell the land. Only she can. The room fell dead silent. Julian stared at the empty space on the desk where Beatrice's silver pen used to lay. He pictured her as he had last seen her, standing in this very room, her gray dress stained with ink, her face pale, trembling, entirely broken. She was a weak, pathetic creature, a merchant's daughter who shrank from conflict. 3 years alone in a decaying manor listening to the ocean would have only made her more fragile, more desperate for his approval. He felt a sudden, arrogant surge of confidence. The old Julian returned, masking the fear with ruthless entitlement. She is my wife, Julian said coldly. She will do exactly as she is commanded. She always has. Julian, Clara said, a malicious smile returning to her thin lips. You must go to Cornwall, drag her out of whatever dusty room she is hiding in. Tell her that if she does not sign the deed over to you, you will divorce her. You will ruin her name in every paper in London. The poor mouse will be so terrified she will sign anything you place in front of her. Julian nodded slowly. He twisted the loose signet ring on his finger, his jaw setting into a hard, determined line. Finch, prepare the transfer documents. Julian ordered, his voice echoing with desperate authority in the dining room. Pack my bags. I am leaving for Cornwall tomorrow morning. I will have her signature by Friday. and we will be finished with Beatrice Hawthorne forever. The hired carriage lurched violently, hitting a deep rut in the muddy coastal road and throwing Julian Sterling hard against the wooden door. He cursed under his breath, gripping the leather handle above his head to steady himself. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He was a man who belonged in velvet-lined coaches with gold crests on the doors and hot bricks resting beneath his feet. Instead, he was being battered around inside a damp, smelling hackney cab that rattled as if it were about to splinter apart at any moment. His fine leather boots were already splattered with mud from a stop at a dreary coaching inn the night before. The cuffs of his coat felt damp and heavy. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted and humiliated by the physical indignity of the journey. Resting on the seat beside him was his leather briefcase. Inside it sat the transfer deed for Cliffside Manor. Julian stared at the briefcase, twisting the loose gold signet ring on his right hand. He spent the agonizing hours of the journey rehearsing exactly what he would say to his wife. He would not be kind. Kindness was a luxury he could no longer afford. He would walk into whatever dark, drafty room she had confined herself to throw the papers onto the nearest table and issue his ultimatum. Sign the deed, or I will publicly divorce you and ruin the Hawthorne name forever. He could picture her reaction perfectly. Beatrice would shrink back, her eyes, those sad, tired hazel eyes, would wide with terror. She would probably be wearing that awful, high-collared gray dress, twisting her hands together in nervous submission. She would cry. She would beg him not to abandon her legally. And then her trembling fingers would take the pen and sign. She was a merchant's daughter. She was terrified of social scandal. It would be entirely effortless. The carriage groaned as it began the steep, winding ascent up the coastal cliffs. The scent of salt water poured through the drafty windows, thick and sharp. Julian braced himself, waiting for the jagged black silhouette of the ruined manor to appear through the morning mist. He remembered the rusted iron gates, the collapsed roof of the east wing, the suffocating gloom of the place. The carriage rounded the final bend. The mist broke, pierced by brilliant, blinding sunlight. Julian looked out the window. His breath stopped completely in his throat. He blinked hard, convinced the lack of sleep was making him hallucinate. He leaned forward, pressing his hands against the glass, his silver-flecked eyes widening in absolute shock. Cliffside Manor was not a ruin. It was an architectural triumph. The collapsed east wing had been entirely resurrected, built with pristine, cream-colored stone and vast panels of sparkling glass that reflected the ocean like a mirror. The grounds, once a wild tangle of dead briars, were perfectly manicured. Terraced gardens cascaded down toward the sea, bursting with white roses and climbing jasmine. The towering front gates were no longer rusted iron. They were solid, polished bronze, gleaming like a beacon of unadulterated wealth. "What is this?" Julian whispered to the empty carriage. "What has happened here?" The carriage rolled to a halt 100 yards from the gates, unable to proceed any further. The long, sweeping driveway was entirely blocked. It was blocked by carriages, dozens of them. They were magnificent, lacquered coaches drawn by matched pairs of thoroughbred horses. Livery drivers stood in quiet conversation, their uniforms crisp and expensive. Julian stared at the painted crests on the carriage doors. He recognized the golden lion of Lord Harrington, the senior minister of the Treasury. He saw the intricate silver crest of the French ambassador. He saw the insignias of shipping magnates, wealthy earls, and powerful politicians, the very men who had been ignoring Julian's letters in London for the past 6 months. Why are they here? Julian's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Finch had mentioned a wealthy, anonymous syndicate developing the port. Had they bought the estate from Beatrice without Julian knowing? Had she been foolish enough to sell his family's ancestral land for a fraction of its worth while he was starving in London? A sudden, hot spike of fury pierced through his shock. If she had sold his land, he would destroy her. He shoved the carriage door open and stepped out. His boots sank slightly into the pristine white gravel. He grabbed his briefcase and marched toward the bronze gates, his frayed coat whipping in the ocean wind. 2 tall guards, dressed in immaculate dark green uniforms, stood at the entrance. They did not bow as Julian approached. They simply crossed their arms, blocking his path. "Invitations, please, sir," the guard on the left said. His tone was polite, but his eyes swept critically over Julian's muddy boots and rumpled, rode, weary clothing. Julian's face flushed with a violent, aristocratic rage. To be asked for an invitation to his own property by a hired servant was an insult he could barely process. "I do not require an invitation," Julian snarled, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. He stepped closer, expecting the men to cower. "I am Julian Sterling, the Duke of Blackwood. I own the ground you are standing on. Step aside immediately before I have you both flogged and thrown into the sea." The guards exchanged a brief, unbothered glance. "The Duke of Blackwood," the first guard repeated slowly. He did not look terrified. He looked mildly amused. "We were instructed to expect you, Your Grace. The Duchess is hosting a reception in the sunroom. You may enter." The guard stepped aside, gesturing toward the sweeping path. He did not offer to take Julian's briefcase. He did not call for a footman to escort him. Julian stood frozen for a fraction of a second. The Duchess is hosting a reception. The words made no sense. Beatrice did not host. Beatrice hid in the corners of drawing rooms. Beatrice was a social liability. Swallowing his confusion and gripping his briefcase so tightly his knuckles turned white, Julian walked through the bronze gates. The scent of jasmine was overpowering, sweet and expensive. As he neared the main doors, the sound of the crashing ocean began to blend with the strains of a live string quartet. Footmen in emerald green livery opened the massive oak doors as he approached. Julian stepped over the threshold, moving from the bright sunlight into the cool, marble-floored expanse of the grand foyer. The air was alive with the sound of clinking crystal, soft laughter, and the low hum of powerful voices. He walked toward the open double doors of the ballroom. The light pouring from the room was brilliant. Julian stopped at the entrance, his heart pounding a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He looked out over a sea of silk, velvet, and diamonds. The room was packed with the most influential figures in the empire, all drinking champagne and talking in hushed, respectful tones. He scanned the corners, his eyes searching the shadows for a frightened woman in a high-collared gray dress. He looked for the shrinking mouse he had sent away 3 years ago. He did not see her. He only saw a room full of apex predators, and for the first time in his life, Julian Sterling realized he was standing at the absolute bottom of the food chain. Julian Sterling stood at the threshold of the Sunlit ballroom, a dark, mud-splattered stain against a backdrop of blinding luxury. He searched the crowd, his silver, flecked eyes darting past the diamond necklaces and tailored coats. He was looking for a ghost. A shrinking, pale woman in a high-collared gray dress who kept her head bowed and her hands tightly clasped. He expected to find her hiding in a corner, nursing a cup of tea, overwhelmed by the presence of her betters. Then the crowd parted slightly near the floor to ceiling windows, and he heard a laugh. It was a rich, melodic, entirely genuine sound. It was the laugh of a woman who owned the ground she stood on. Julian's gaze snapped toward the sound. His breath caught sharply in his chest, hitting him like a physical blow. Standing in the center of a circle of powerful men was Beatrice. But it could not be Beatrice. The woman before him wore a gown of flowing emerald green silk that moved like water around her body. There was no stifling corset, no rigid collar, choking her throat. Her shoulders were bare, kissed by the sun, her posture straight and radiating an effortless, terrifying sovereignty. Her thick chestnut hair, which Julian had only ever seen, pinned back and severe. Agonizingly tight styles cascaded down her back in heavy, natural waves. She held a crystal coupe of champagne in one hand, listening intently to the French ambassador, who was hanging on to her every word with profound respect. Julian stared. His mind violently rejected the image, but his eyes could not look away. The pale, anxious merchant's daughter was gone. In her place stood a queen. She was breathtaking. She was vibrant, alive, and utterly untouchable. And for the first time in his life, Julian Sterling realized exactly what he had thrown away. He had discarded a diamond because he lacked the vision to see it in the dark. A heavy, suffocating panic began to rise in his throat. He needed to reassert control. He needed to remind this room and this woman who he was. He was the Duke of Blackwood. She was his property. Julian stepped forward onto the pristine Italian marble. His muddy boots made a faint, wet squelch. "Beatrice!" His voice cut through the elegant murmur of the ballroom. It was a harsh, commanding bark, the voice of a master calling a disobedient hound. The string quartet faltered, a violinist hitting a sharp, discordant note, before the music died completely. The conversation stopped. Dozens of faces turned toward the doorway. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, but it was not the silence of respect for a duke. It was the hushed, electric silence of an audience, watching a man walk willingly toward his own execution. At the far end of the room, Beatrice slowly turned. Julian braced himself. He waited for the wide eyes, the nervous tremor, the immediate submission. He gripped his leather briefcase, ready to drop the transfer deed onto the nearest table and end this farce. Beatrice did not tremble. She did not drop her glass. She looked at him across the expanse of the ballroom, her hazel eyes completely clear and devastatingly calm. There was no anger in her expression. Anger would have implied she still cared enough to be hurt. Instead, there was only a mild aristocratic curiosity, the kind of look one might give a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. Julian forced his legs to move, marching across the marble floor. The crowd parted for him, but they did not bow. They stared at his frayed coat, his unshaven jaw, and the mud trailing behind his boots. He felt the weight of their judgment burning into his skin. He stopped 5 feet away from her. "Wife!" Julian said, his voice tight, attempting to project an authority he could no longer feel. "You will dismiss these people at once. I have traveled 3 days through wretched conditions. We have legal matters to discuss, and you will sign the documents I have brought?" Lord Harrington, standing just to Beatrice's right, raised a distinguished eyebrow, but said nothing. He simply watched the Duke with quiet pity. Beatrice took a slow, delicate sip of her champagne. She lowered the glass, the emerald silk of her sleeve shifting fluidly. "Julian," she said. Her voice was perfectly measured, carrying a chilling elegance that echoed through the silent room. What an unexpected disruption. Julian's jaw clenched. "It is not a disruption. This is my house. You are my wife. You will do as you are told?" "Your house?" Beatrice repeated softly. She tilted her head, a small, amused smile playing on her lips. I seem to recall you standing in a drawing room 3 years ago, assuring me that this estate was a worthless pile of rotting stones. You sent me here to be forgotten. It appears your memory is as frayed as the cuffs of your coat." A few quiet gasps rippled through the gathered elite. A sharp, muffled snicker came from the direction of the French ambassador. Julian's face flushed a dark, violent red. He stepped closer, attempting to physically intimidate her. "Do not play games with me, Beatrice. I have the deed in this briefcase. The banks in London are no longer your primary concern." Beatrice interrupted, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, freezing him in place. She did not raise her voice, but the sheer weight of her composure crushed him. She turned gracefully to the men standing beside her. "Lord Harrington, gentlemen, allow me to introduce my husband, the Duke of Blackwood. As you can see, the journey from London has been rather taxing on him. He seems to have lost his manners somewhere in the mud." "Indeed, your grace," Lord Harrington murmured, offering Julian a patronizing nod. "The roads can be quite unforgiving to those who are unprepared." Julian stood paralyzed. The absolute humiliation was choking him. He was a duke, and he was being openly mocked by ministers and merchants in front of his own wife. But he could not scream. If he screamed, he would look like a madman. Beatrice was maintaining perfect, high society decorum, and, by doing so, she was entirely destroying him. "I will not be humiliated by you," Julian hissed, leaning in so only she could hear. "I need that signature." Beatrice looked at him. She looked at his hollow cheeks, the desperate panic in his silver eyes, and the loose gold signet ring on his trembling hand. "We will speak in my study, Julian," she said smoothly, her voice echoing into the silent room. "When I am finished entertaining my guests, do wait in the hall. And please, try not to track any more mud onto the marble. Mrs. Gable works very hard to keep it clean." She turned her back on him, raising her glass to the ambassador, completely dismissing the Duke of Blackwood, as if he were nothing more than a bad draught of wind. Julian Sterling paced the length of the private study, his muddy boots leaving a faint, damning trail across the woven Persian rug. The room was vast, lined with towering bookshelves and massive maritime charts. It did not look like the drawing room of a duchess. It looked like the war room of an empire. In the center sat a magnificent mahogany desk. Julian unlatched his leather briefcase with trembling, angry fingers. He pulled out the thick parchment of the transfer deed and slapped it down onto the polished wood, smoothing out the edges. He was breathing hard, trying to push down the icy dread that had settled in his stomach. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He would not be cowed by a merchant's daughter wearing an expensive gown. She was playing a part. She was still Beatrice. All he had to do was apply the right pressure, threaten her with public ruin, and she would fold. Before he could finalize his strategy, the heavy oak door of the study flew open. Julian spun around, expecting Beatrice, but it was not his wife. It was Lady Clara. She looked entirely unhinged. The deep burgundy dress she had worn in London was now heavily splattered with coastal mud, the hem torn from catching on a carriage step. Her perfectly styled blonde ringlets had collapsed into a damp, chaotic mess, and her face was pale with a mixture of exhaustion and sheer panic. "Clara, Julian demanded, shocked. What in God's name are you doing here?
They came to the house, Julian!
Clara gasped, shutting the door behind her and leaning heavily against it. The creditors, they arrived just hours after you left. They threatened to start seizing the furniture by the end of the week. I could not stay in that dreadful, freezing tomb. I hired the fastest carriage I could find on credit. Tell me you have made the little mouse sign the deed. We must sell this ghastly place immediately! Before Julian could answer, a side door connecting the study to the master suite opened. Beatrice stepped into the room. The sunlight caught the emerald green silk of her gown, illuminating her like a stained glass saint. She moved with a slow, predatory grace, the fabric brushing silently against the floorboards. Clara froze. The frantic words died in her throat. She stared at the radiant, statuesque woman before her, her icy blue eyes blinking rapidly, as if trying to clear a mirage. She looked at Beatrice's flawless complexion, the heavy chestnut hair falling freely down her back, and the aura of absolute, terrifying composure she projected. Beatrice. Clara whispered, the name sounding foreign on her tongue. Then, years of ingrained defensive arrogance kicked in. She straightened her spine, forcing a cruel sneer onto her face. Well, look at you. You may dress a merchant's daughter in imported silk, Julian, but she still hides in a dusty room. Have you been playing Queen of the Ruins, Beatrice? How utterly pathetic. Beatrice did not flinch. She did not even blink. She merely looked at Clara the way one might look at a dying insect on a windowsill. You tore the hem of your dress, Clara? Beatrice noted, her voice mild and entirely unsympathetic, and it is at least 2 seasons out of fashion. Has Madame Dubois finally locked her doors to you? Clara's face went violently red. She opened her mouth to shriek a response, but Beatrice had already dismissed her, turning her cool hazel gaze entirely upon Julian. She walked slowly toward the mahogany desk. Julian immediately stepped forward, tapping his finger against the parchment he had laid out. Enough of this theater, Beatrice, Julian said, his voice hard. You have had your fun parading in front of those politicians, but reality has arrived. You will sign this deed. You will transfer the ownership of Cliffside Manor to me so that I may liquidate it. If you refuse, I will drag your name through every society paper in London. I will divorce you, and you will be a ruined woman. Beatrice reached the desk. She looked down at the transfer deed. Then her eyes shifted slightly to the center of the desk, resting exactly where she had left. It was the heavy silver ink pen. She reached out and picked it up. The metal gleamed in the sunlight. Julian let out a sharp, triumphant breath. He had won. He watched her long, delicate fingers grip the silver barrel, waiting for the ink to flow. Clara, too, let out a shaky sigh of relief, stepping closer to the desk to witness the submission. But Beatrice did not uncap the pen. She did not look at the deed. Instead, she used the blunt end of the silver pen to casually, deliberately push Julian's transfer deed off the edge of the desk. The parchment fluttered uselessly through the air and landed on the rug at his muddy boots. Julian stared at the fallen paper, his mind stalling. What are you doing? What are you doing? Beatrice reached into the drawer of the mahogany desk and pulled out a thick, dark leather folio. The one Lord Harrington had brought her. She dropped it heavily onto the center of the desk. I am not signing your deed, Julian, Beatrice said softly. The absolute stillness in her voice made the hairs on the back of Julian's neck stand up. Because you have no power to threaten me with ruin. You are already ruined. She flipped the folio open. Inside was a stack of heavy, watermarked documents bearing the crests of London's most prominent banks and private lenders. Julian demanded, his voice cracking slightly. These, Beatrice said, sliding the stack of documents across the polished wood, are your debts. Julian looked down. His silver eyes scanned the top page, recognizing the astronomical sum he owed to the Royal Bank. He frantically pushed it aside, revealing the next page, a private loan he had taken to cover Clara's gambling debts. The next page was the mortgage on his hunting lodge. The next was a line of credit for his London tailor. Every single secret, suffocating debt he had accrued over the last 3 years was sitting on her desk. How did you get these? Clara shrieked, clutching the edge of the desk. These are private. They were private, Beatrice corrected smoothly, until the creditors realized the Duke of Blackwood was entirely insolvent. They were eager to offload the toxic debt to a willing buyer. 3 blind proxies purchased them on behalf of a private maritime syndicate. Julian's breath stopped. The loose signet ring on his finger felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked up at her, the horrific truth finally breaking through his arrogant armor. The syndicate. Julian whispered, the blood draining completely from his face. The anonymous buyer. You did not send me to an exile, Julian. Beatrice said, her voice echoing with devastating finality. You sent me to a deep water port. I used my father's shipping contacts to build an empire while you were busy playing a wealthy lord in London with the last of my dowry. I did not just survive Cliffside Manor, I weaponized it. Julian's knees weakened. He gripped the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. The bank did not refuse your extension because you lacked funds. Julian. Beatrice continued, her hazel eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. They refused you because I instructed them to. I own the mortgage on your London house. I own the debts of your sister. I own the very coat on your back. She stepped closer, leaning slightly over the desk, the silver pen held loosely in her fingers like a royal scepter. I am not the price of your title, she said, her voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper that silenced the room entirely. I am its owner, and I am foreclosing. The silence inside the study was not peaceful. It was a vacuum violently sucking the oxygen directly from Julian Sterling's lungs. He stared at the thick stack of watermarked bank papers on the mahogany desk. The intricate red wax seals of the London lenders seemed to bleed into the parchment. The numbers written in sharp black ink danced mockingly before his silver-flecked eyes. It was real. All of it. His entire existence, his ancestral home, his title, and his freedom were sitting in a leather folio controlled by the woman he had discarded like trash. No, Clara whimpered, her voice breaking the stillness. She backed away from the desk, her muddy burgundy dress catching on the leg of a chair. No, she is lying, Julian. She is a merchant's daughter, trying to frighten us.
It is a forgery!
Julian did not answer her. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched the crisp edge of the Royal Bank's foreclosure notice. He knew the signature of the bank's director. He knew the exact crushing weight of the debt it represented. It was not a forgery. It was a death sentence. Beatrice picked up the heavy silver ink pen. She did not look at Clara, whose frantic, hysterical sobbing was beginning to echo in the large room. Beatrice laid the pen carefully across the top of the debt folio. It was a perfectly deliberate gesture, a physical period at the end of a 3-year sentence. If you will excuse me, Beatrice said, her voice remaining as calm and smooth as glass. I have neglected my guests long enough. The afternoon tide is turning, and the sea breeze is much too pleasant to waste in here. She turned her back on them. The emerald green silk of her gown rippled fluidly as she walked past the weeping Clara, pushed open the glass French doors of the study, and stepped out onto the grand stone terrace. The terrace was bathed in brilliant Cornwall sunlight, overlooking the crashing ocean below. Dozens of the Empire's most powerful men and women had spilled out from the ballroom to enjoy the coastal air, holding crystal flutes of champagne and conversing in low, elegant tones. Julian watched her walk away. Panic, raw and absolute, finally broke through his paralysis. If she walked away now, if she foreclosed on the debts, he would not just lose his house. A duke in debtor's prison was the ultimate disgrace. He would be stripped of his societal standing, mocked in the papers, forced to live in the shadows of the continent like a vagabond. His title would become a permanent laughing curse. He could not fight her. He had no leverage. He had no money. He had nothing left but his physical body. Beatrice, wait! Julian bolted toward the French doors, entirely abandoning his sister, who had collapsed onto the Persian rug in a fit of hysterical tears. He stumbled over the threshold, bursting out into the bright sunlight of the terrace. His sudden, frantic appearance drew the attention of everyone. The gentle hum of elite conversation died instantly. Lord Harrington paused mid-sentence. The French ambassador lowered his glass. Every eye on the terrace turned to look at the Duke of Blackwood. They saw a man whose tailored coat was frayed and splattered with thick, dark mud. They saw a man whose face was pale, unshaven, and twisted in absolute terror. Beatrice stopped near the edge of the stone balustrade, the ocean roaring far below her. She turned slowly, the ocean breeze catching her dark chestnut hair. She looked at him with that same devastatingly empty curiosity. Julian tried to walk toward her, to demand respect, to stand tall, and project the aristocratic pride he had been raised on. But his legs simply refused to hold him. The sheer weight of his ruin pressed down on his shoulders like a physical anvil. Right there, under the blazing sun, in front of the most powerful men in the country. The Duke of Blackwood's knees buckled. He dropped. The sound of his knees hitting the pristine white marble of the terrace was a sickening, heavy thud. Mud and dirty water from his boots immediately stained the flawless stone. A collective quiet gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. Aristocrats did not kneel. They certainly did not kneel in mud, in broad daylight, in front of an audience. But Julian was no longer an aristocrat. He was a beggar. Beatrice, Julian choked out, looking up at her from the ground. Tears hot and humiliating, spilled over his eyelashes and tracked through the grime on his cheeks. Please. Beatrice stood perfectly still. The emerald silk blew gently around her ankles. She looked down at him, but she did not smile. There was no gleeful cruelty in her face. I was blind. Julian wept, his voice breaking, cracking under the desperate need to survive. I was a fool, a stupid, arrogant fool. I was terrified of losing my status, and I took it out on you. I punished you for my own failures. He crawled forward a few inches, his muddy hands leaving dark streaks on the white marble. You are not ugly, Beatrice. He sobbed, repeating the insult he had thrown at her 3 years ago, hoping to somehow undo the damage. You are beautiful. You are the most beautiful, brilliant woman I have ever known. I see it now. Please, I beg of you, do not destroy me. The crowd watched in absolute, horrified fascination. Come back to London with me. Julian pleaded, raising his trembling, mud-stained hands toward her, the loose gold signet ring catching the light. I will restore you. I will announce to the world that you are the true, undisputed Duchess of Blackwood. I will worship the ground you walk upon. I will give you anything you desire. Just forgive me. Please, Beatrice, forgive me. He reached out, desperate to grab the hem of her gown, to anchor himself to her. Beatrice looked at his outstretched hands. With a slow, deliberate grace, she took a single step backward. Julian's muddy fingers grasped nothing but empty air. The rejection was silent, but it echoed louder than the crashing waves. Beatrice looked down at the weeping, broken man on the marble floor. She saw the tears, she heard the apologies, and she realized something profound. She felt absolutely nothing for him. The pain was gone. The desperation for his love was gone. The anger had burned out long ago, leaving behind a cold, expensive peace. The apology he was offering was not born of love. It was born of terror. He did not want her. He just wanted his life back, and he was 3 years too late. The Cornwall wind swept across the stone terrace, catching the heavy chestnut waves of Beatrice's hair. She looked down at Julian Sterling, the Duke of Blackwood, who was kneeling in a puddle of dirty water and mud on her pristine white marble. His shoulders shook with violent, desperate sobs. His expensive, frayed coat was stained. His perfectly aristocratic face was contorted in absolute terror. For 2 years of her life, this man had been her entire world. He had been the judge of her worth, the arbiter of her happiness, the silent, looming shadow that dictated whether she was allowed to breathe. She had spent countless nights crying into the dark, praying to whatever God would listen that Julian would look at her with even a fraction of the warmth he showed his hunting dogs. Now, looking at him, Beatrice felt a profound, chilling emptiness. There was no sudden rush of vindictive joy. There was no triumphant surge of adrenaline. She did not want to scream at him, or strike him, or watch him bleed. She simply looked at him and realized, with absolute clarity, that he was nothing. He was just a hollow, pathetic man who had built his entire identity around a meaningless title, and without her money to prop him up. He was entirely incapable of standing on his own. Beatrice. Julian begged, his voice raspy and broken, his muddy hands hovering just inches from the hem of her emerald silk gown. I will do anything. Anything you ask, just give me another chance. Let me show you the husband I should have been. Beatrice held her crystal coupe of champagne perfectly level. She did not spill a single drop. You are not sorry, Julian, Beatrice said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried effortlessly over the rhythmic crashing of the ocean below. It echoed across the silent terrace, slicing through the heavy tension of the gathered elite. Julian choked on a sob, shaking his head frantically. I am. Before God, Beatrice, I am entirely. You are not sorry. She repeated, her tone hardening just enough to freeze the breath in his throat. You are merely bankrupt. Julian stared up at her, his silver eyes wide and bloodshot. You do not regret how you treated me. Beatrice continued, her words precise, elegant, and utterly lethal. You do not regret the humiliation you subjected me to, or the cruelty of your sister, or the day you handed me a silver pen and told me I was nothing but a bitter medicine. You felt entirely justified in doing all of those things because you believed you would never have to pay for them. She took a slow, deliberate step to the side, forcing Julian to adjust his kneeling position to keep her in his line of sight. You are only weeping now, because you looked into a leather folio and realized that the merchant's daughter you discarded has quietly bought the ground beneath your feet. She said smoothly, you do not want a wife, Julian. You want a treasury. You do not want to worship me. You want to survive me. No. Julian whispered, the words slipping out of him like a dying breath. That is not true. I see you now. I see what you are. Yes, you do. Beatrice tilted her head, a small, chilling smile touching the corners of her mouth. "You see that I no longer need you." The absolute truth of her words hung in the sunlit air. Lord Harrington, standing a few yards away, slowly lowered his gaze to the marble floor, almost as if witnessing the execution of the Duke was too private, too devastating an event to look at directly. "What will you do to me?" Julian asked, his voice entirely devoid of hope. He slumped forward slightly, his muddy hands resting on the white stone. "Will you foreclose? Will you send me to debtor's prison?" Beatrice looked out over his head toward the vast, endless expanse of the blue ocean. She thought of the dark, suffocating drawing room in London. She thought of the grey dress with the black ink stain. She thought of the 3 years she had spent turning ruins into a kingdom. "I have already instructed the banks to seize the London estate by the end of the week," Beatrice said calmly, "and the hunting lodge, and the country manor in Kent. Every property tied to your debts will be liquidated." Julian let out a low, agonizing sound, closing his eyes as the finality of his ruin crushed him. "However," Beatrice added, her voice dropped into a soft, conversational murmur, "I will not pursue you for the remaining balance. I will not have you thrown into a cell. You may keep your precious empty title. You may keep the Blackwood name. You may take Clara and live on whatever charity your remaining friends are willing to offer a penniless duke." Julian opened his eyes, looking up at her with a mixture of confusion and profound, sickening despair. Living as a beggar with a title was a social death far more agonizing than a quick execution. "Why?" he whispered. "Because destroying you completely would require me to care about you," Beatrice answered simply. "And I do not." "You are dismissed, Julian." She did not wait for his response. She did not offer him a hand to help him up from the mud. Instead, Beatrice stepped back. She reached down with her free hand and lightly pinched the luxurious emerald silk of her skirt. Keeping her spine perfectly, immaculately straight, she sank down into a deep, flawless finishing school curtsy. It was the exact gesture of aristocratic submission she had been forced to learn to please his family. Now, executed in the blazing sunlight over the broken body of the man who had demanded it, it was the ultimate, devastating weapon of disdain. "Thank you for your generosity, your grace," she said, her voice dripping with sweet, lethal irony. "I have found that I much prefer living like a queen in exile than dying as a shadow in your castle." She rose gracefully from the curtsy. The emerald silk settled perfectly around her. Without a single backward glance, Beatrice turned. The crowd of ambassadors, ministers, and shipping magnates immediately parted for her, bowing their heads in profound respect as she walked past them. She stepped through the French doors, leaving the blazing terrace and re-entering the cool, magnificent luxury of her sunlit ballroom. Outside on the white marble terrace, the Duke of Blackwood remained on his knees. The mud from his boots had stained the stone permanently. He stared at the empty space where his wife had stood, the loose gold signet ring slipping dangerously close to the knuckle of his trembling finger. No one stepped forward to help him. No one offered him a word of comfort. The elite of the empire simply turned away, resuming their elegant conversations, treating him exactly as he had once treated Beatrice, as if he did not exist. Julian Sterling lowered his head, pressing his face into his muddy hands, and finally wept. The sound of his sobbing was entirely swallowed by the relentless, deafening roar of the ocean below. The unending, victorious heartbeat of the Sovereign of Cliffside.